This is the first Jornathii Ork War, a summarized recollection, read by Aaron Reynolds. Um, in this video, I'll be reviewing the Jornathii Ork War, which is a shared supra-narrative campaign setting inside Warhammer 40,000. It has been a shared collaborative hobby and writing project that several people across the United States and England have participated in. This video is intended to be a brief summary of the events of the First Jornathii Ork War, and it is by no means going to be comprehensive. The collected works related to the First Jornathii Ork War and to Volland in general, which is the setting in which Jornath takes place, is in excess of 1,000 pages of information. So this is going to be a brief, fairly informal review of the events of the First Jornathii Ork War. Rather than using the in-universe voice that is typically presented for material related to Jornath, which is to say, the way that this video will be produced is from my perspective as a gamer and as somebody who's worked on the setting and as somebody who's helped to facilitate events for Jornath. So I'll talk a little bit about the actual real world game, some of the motivations behind what happened and how it was done, and I won't be using in-universe voice essentially for this video. So Jornath initially started with the idea that we would try and get back into 40K after a lot of the club kind of got dispossessed with Games Workshop at the end of 5th edition Warhammer 40,000. It was initially supposed to be a small scale skirmish between orcs and Imperial forces that we would just kind of keep going for as long as we had common interest in it, right? It was always supposed to be a small scale games, just a way to explore different little facets of orcs and Imperial units in the 40K setting. With most of our interests kind of leaning into 15mm gaming, generic sci-fi, that kind of stuff. It sort of ballooned into a decade-long, more than a decade at this point, supra-narrative setting, which is a term that I'm using to describe a series of campaigns that are all related to a wider campaign. So normally in 40K and in other games like Warhammer, which are battles games, war games in a more traditional sense, narrative play tends to be 3 to maybe a dozen games that are linked together. They tell a consistent narrative story and then they sort of terminate. Jornath and the campaigns that have come after it are all linked. They have multiple campaigns that happen within them. They shape the way that the story is told, right? So what tends to happen is that myself or somebody else who's organizing an event will have a couple of predetermined outcomes, right? So the story up to whatever the most recent timeline is will have already been told. The writer will have basically determined a couple of different possible outcomes, and then those outcomes will be shaped by the way that players interact with the missions and the game as they play it. So I'll talk about that a little bit more. It'll maybe make a little bit more sense when we get into it. But the storytelling aspect of Jornath is entirely shaped by the players, which I think makes it very unique. So, yeah, we'll get started. So, chapter 1 is the prelude to war. We'll talk here a little bit about Jornath's role in the wider Volland sector in the Urient subsector, and why the first Jornathii Ork War comes to pass. So, Valen sector is something that I created a long time ago when I first got into 40k, and it was supposed to be just a way that I could like make sense of 40k as a setting in my head. It was a way that I could like link all my little games together at the game store, that kind of stuff. Jornath initially was not a part of Voland. Jornath was created by Christopher Hollowell of Sippin' on Paintwater fame, but Jornath was created in his blog for his Mortifactors, and kind of created from there, and we kind of riffed off of it and extrapolated. Jornath eventually gets added into the story of Voland sector, which, I think if you're not used to role-playing games or tabletop games or that kind of stuff, the way that I would think about it is like, take like Star Wars or like Lord of the Rings, these kind of really big, vast settings that are really kind of common knowledge in popular media. Warhammer is that way, right? So it has like a big, expansive, predefined setting with lots of factions and systems and things that take place in it. Voland was a way for me to basically cut a little slice of that for myself and write in it. So where like you might have Middle Earth, where all this stuff is happening, it would be the equivalent of me going like, oh, this little area of coastline is this kingdom, and then like writing in it, so that I can still have Gandalf show up, or I can have orcs and Uruk-hai and the Rohirrim and Gondor and all that stuff show up in that setting, but it still works. That's what Voland is for Warhammer 40,000. It's a way to contextualize everything and keep it narratively linked for myself. So when Jornath started, I kind of added it to that and continued to keep writing in it, which ironically has been very helpful in continuing to develop additional stories and narratives and things based off of Jornath in like the long run. So Jornath sits in the southeastern portion of the Urient subsector in Voland. Urient is, I would say, quaint and provincial, right? It has seen quite a bit of strife in recent history. The Death Guard and other secessionist and cult forces had a big fight with the Imperials in the central part of the region, going through a stretch of agri-worlds or agricultural worlds, farming worlds, that are called the Orchards of Urient. Jornath sits at the southernmost end of that line of systems and was unaffected by the Death Guard attack. Because of where it sits, Jornath is at the axis of two major warp conduits, so major trade lanes. It is the place where, if you're a farmer, and you want to move goods into the next sector over, or you want to ferry them quickly into the northern sector, into Ultramar, you would go to Jornath. Jornath is a central distribution hub. It has multiple safe warp conduits through it. So it's important to regional trade. Because of this, it's made it a wealthy imperial world. An imperial world is essentially a tithe grade. Every planet inside of the Imperium of Man has different classifications. An imperial world is the most common, which basically means it is a mixture of manufacturing, trade, agriculture, all those things. It's a standard Earth-like planet. And because of the trade that's coming out of the Orchards of Urient, it makes Jornath very economically successful. Jornath has a esoteric military and cultural system. Part of that was us kind of having fun narratively with thinking about how disparate human cultures would work in different parts of the wider Warhammer 40,000 narrative, right? So, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but in a little bit later in the slides. But Jornath's military and cultural system is a little bit strange. It's not sort of standard. It has lots of idiosyncrasies that make it a little bit interesting to just navigate, and that causes problems when the orcs invade. It's ruled by High Civitan from Hive, which is its capital city. We'll look more at Hive in just a few moments. There's also the Council of Patricians. Basically, Jornath has an advanced version of the peerage in an aristocratic system with noble families and heritage and lineage and all that stuff that has become predominant. So there's a lot of noble houses who are all vying for glory and honor and getting a place of prestige in the Council of Patricians, or potentially becoming the High Civitan of the planet, because it comes with a lot of money and a lot of influence and all that stuff. Supreme Arms Master Vazinos is the head of the Jornath Planetary Defense Forces. That's a little bit more of a complicated title, as we'll kind of get over the Jornath military in just a few minutes. But he becomes a really pivotal figure in the early part of the First Jornathii Ork War in basically making the best of a bad situation. One more note for the kind of political and cultural roles of different groups on Jornath is Prima Jamma. Prima Jamma is a Mechanicus outpost that is in northwestern Jornath. The entirety of Valen's sector in general is under the auspices and protection, quote unquote, of Forge World Metallica. So Prima Jamma is a wayward, long-stretched outpost of the Metallican Tech Magi. It plays a very significant role in the war, especially in the mid-war period and onwards. And the Mechanicus on Jornath has a kind of interesting interconnectivity with the culture of the northern parts of the planet. So this is a map of terrestrial Jornath. It's a little pixelated here, but I have a nicer full color, like very pretty big version of this map that you can zoom all the way into if you really want to. So Prima Jamma is up here in the northwest, as I said. This area up here is Usamiljan. It's it and Manfredi at Prima is where the majority of the conflict takes place. Hive is here, and what would become known as the Orc Exclusion Zone, which we'll get to in just a few minutes, lies right to the east of it, here along the coastline. So the majority of the War for Jornath takes place on this central large-scale continent. It occasionally spills over in Panlestivos and Kostoy, but the majority of the fighting takes place all across the central continent. And we'll kind of explore that in just a few moments. So, how does the conflict begin? It's a little bit interesting, and the initial games that we played for the War for Jornath take place a few months after the orcs initially land on Jornath's surface. It wasn't until much later that myself and some others worked on how that happened, right? Why did the orcs show up in Jornath and all that kind of stuff? So the reasons behind why the orcs were pulled into Jornath are that Tau operations in Eastern Volland are kind of geared towards destabilizing Imperial footholds in the area. Eastern Volland is primarily the Baelor subsector, which is a bunch of old, what used to be Xenos empires that have been destroyed by the Imperium, and it's kind of lawless space. It butts up against a pocket of orc-held planets called the Skinner Worlds in the southeastern portion of the map of Volland, right? The Tau Excuse me. The Tau engage in a series of conflicts throughout Baylor subsector and Orient, which ends up culminating in the Scouring of Halbras, which is a major confrontation between the Tau and their auxiliaries and the Imperial Guard on an agri-world called Halabras. The Tau get repulsed from that. That was a full campaign. It was maybe, I want to say, eight or nine games. So it was kind of a one-shot type thing. After the Tau are pushed back from Halbras, they go to more of a covert operations level. These games, those sorts of covert operations, were played in Inquisitor and in Dark Heresy, which both sort of, well, Dark Heresy is a role-playing game, and Inquisitor is a kind of hybrid role-playing game slash battles game. And they ended up fighting for basically trade rights with some of these lesser Xenos empires that exist on the fringes of Imperial space, with a faction called the Obragov Cartel. The Obragov Cartel is a coalition of rogue traders and Imperial noble houses who have been participating in the cold trade, or the illicit moving of alien goods and material into Imperial worlds, right? High society in the Imperium loves that kind of stuff. They want to get their hands on it however they can. And a lot of the former Xenos empires are just happy to have food and like basic materials after the Imperium came in initially and destroyed their cultures. So the Tau initially do a lot of sort of counter merchant operations against the Obragov cartel. The rogue traders get upset at being isolated out of their very lucrative cold trade. They come in with a set of mercenaries on their own, and they fight what's called the Frontier War. The Frontier War is across a series of systems in the Baylor subsector, which is just over the border from Jornath and right along the edge of the Skinner worlds. This ends up attracting the attention of the orcs in the Skinner worlds, and the orcs there start to mobilize and push into this burgeoning conflict between human mercenaries and the Tau and their auxiliaries. The Tau, not willing to get involved in a major conflict with orcs, withdraw, and the Obragov cartel does the same. Some of the cartel members flee to the nearest, safest port of call, which is Jornath. They pull with them the initial groups of orcs that would end up landing on the planet. That would be the flight from the Baylor subsector to Jornath. These orcs are primarily from the Death Skulls clan and the Blood Axis clan, and would kind of pose a really serious problem for the planetary defense forces on Jornath. Part 2, Early War. So, initial landings on Jornath. Before we get into the blow-by-blow of the different actions on the planet, I'll talk a little bit about the cohort system, Huskarls, and the Mustermen. So this gets back to that esoteric nature of Jornath's culture that I talked about initially. The cohort system itself, you can kind of think of as a fracturing of different militias across the planet. Cohorts are anything from a 20,000 man strong, well-equipped private army to a hunting club. It essentially means a local militia of some kind that is designed for local defense. It has different meanings over the span of Jornath's history, but it ends up causing a lot of problems when the planetary defense forces are called upon to actually defend Jornath itself from a coordinated invasion by aliens. Housecarls Housecarls are basically the private bodyguard or household infantry of a noble house. They're usually very well equipped, decently trained, but are loyal specifically to their liege lord and the family that they are a part of. So they can be a little bit more problematic in terms of they may not be willing to go out and hold a highway or a bridge or a power station, but they will absolutely hold like the local estate of their liege lord, which makes that slightly complicated. The mustermen are essentially like corporate militia. They are part of imperial guilds, and the guild itself is providing weapons and training for this personnel, rather than them doing it themselves or there being a dedicated cohort that is over, a regional area. So rather than it being a civil or like county level, state level, National Guard force, it is the local bakery has gotten all of its workers together and given them all small arms, and it's told them to hold the like middle of town, that kind of thing. So the disparate and fractured nature of the cohort system, the housecarls, the guild musters, means that coordinated defenses of parts of Jornath is very difficult in the initial portions of the War for Jornath. Planetary defense schema is designed by subsector government. So in this case, the Tactica Command on Casa Uriant, which is the subsector capital world, formulated a plan of action for potential invasion of Jornath. That put different units in different places as they understood them. So on paper, for instance, the Kula Conservator Cohort, the KCC, which is a 20,000 man, essentially national army designed to defend Kula Hive and its local territory, was seen as a regiment. And at the same time, the 56th Lumbermen's Guild Muster in Ursamiljan was seen as an equivalent regiment, but it only numbers 50 men. So there's a disparity there. And that causes some successes, and it causes a lot of critical failures. Supreme Arms Master Vazinas, because he's a local, understands some of the eccentric nature of the way that the cultural systems on Jornath and its military operate, and has tried to kind of compete with the different noble houses to coordinate a successful defense. The initial orc rocks and landing craft that come down in mass land in what becomes known as the Orc Exclusion Zone, or the OEZ. And this is the area to the immediate east of Kula Hive. Lots of orcs land there. Because of clerical errors, as I mentioned before, there are a lot of men-at-arms there to contain the orcs, right? Vazinas is very key in coordinating this defense. The orcs that land cannot get out of their landing areas and are stuck there. The orcs essentially build large scrap cities, and the Imperial PDF forces, the cohorts, can't really affect any kind of major breakthrough. Ursamiljan, the entirety of the northern portion of the continent of Western Jornath, collapses to orcs. While that's a smaller portion of the orc invasion fleets land there, they're fractured and begin to propagate exponentially, gaining quicker victories as they kind of move through the mountain chains. It's harder for Imperial forces to locate them. It's harder to get men into places where they can confront the orcs. And so the orcs like very quickly gain a lot of territory in the mountains. There are some pretty big maneuvers that happen in this period. And the destruction of the Greyhaven Bridge, which is the super bridge that goes from the Ursamiljan Mountains into Prima Jamma, is one of them. So Prima Jamma is never directly attacked during the War for Jornath. The Mechanicus cut the bridge lines to them and are able to keep the orcs at bay with their own Skitari and that kind of thing. The very first battle that was played by anyone in the War for Jornath is the Battle of the Citrate Valley, which is basically orcs coming down out of the mountains into the sort of central region of Jornath and getting confronted by cohorts in prepared positions. So this is a couple of weeks after landing. The orcs have gotten in. They've made these sweeping advances through the mountains. The Mechanicus have cut themselves off from the rest of the planet. The orcs are coming down to the like more fertile populated regions, and the cohorts there have had time to prepare defenses. Specifically in the Citrate Valley, which is a primary valley that goes into a cultural city called Guffmansplatz. Last thing here, I'll touch on it very briefly, is the breaking of Satana Station. So Satana Station is Jornath's primary orbital defense hub. It's destroyed by orc cruisers in like the very opening of the conflict, and so Jornath's system defense fleet has a tough time maintaining orbital control for many of the opening years of the conflict. So the first campaign book that gets written for Jornath is Operation Remit Small. It's launched out of Guffmansplatz, which is down here at the very bottom, and it's led by Jarl Mondix, who is a charismatic nobleman from Guffmansplatz. He thinks he's going to get in there. He's going to sort of push into the mountains and kind of fix the orcs in place and get this big set piece battle out of the way. And that Imperial like faith and fury will see the aliens undone, essentially. It's the first major Imperial offensive of the war. It's primarily fought against Blood Axe warbands under Colonel Grimskull, who is a rather capable orc commander. It is a massive strategic orc victory in the Northern Theater. It kind of sets the tenor for a lot of what would end up happening in the early war. So the Imperials go in here and like I think the Imperials just like lost every single game they played. Basically, it was a complete massacre with guard forces getting overrun and outmaneuvered and ambushed. So it ends up being this like really opening stage of complete disaster, right? To alleviate some of the pressure and allow Imperial PDF forces to withdraw, Space Marine raids on Orc command and control and Orc encampments and that kind of stuff take place in Usamiljan, which leads to Space Marine units getting isolated in the mountains and kind of delaying the role they can play in the wider conflict for quite some time. So immediately following Operation Remit Small, the Orcs launch a major counterattack. This counterattack is called the Summer Offensive, and it would be multiple years of games that we would play. What the Summer Offensive demonstrates is significant coordination of the orcs across multiple fronts of the conflict. Not only are the orcs attacking out of the mountains down into Guffmansplatz through the Citrate Valley, but they're also attacking at the orc exclusion zone, which shows that the orcs have planetary level coordination, which is incredibly dangerous, obviously, for the PDF forces on Jornath itself. This becomes a major problem with Warboss Crump, who is played by Jim Barr. He kind of pushes his way south really, really, really hard and besieges Fort Barris. Fort Barris is, on paper, a fortress, but in reality, it's sort of a ruined castle that was used by a company to make wine. So it becomes a defensive installation again, but it's not really designed to hold out for a long period, and it's kind of permeable. It is kind of the last best bastion, keeping the orcs from breaking fully into the central region of Jornath, called Manfredi et Prima, which is the central sort of like nation state. KCC, the Kilo Conservator cohort, and Space Marines contain attacks coming out of the Orc exclusion zone toward Kula Hive, which is very fortunate. The Orcs are able to take a lot of territory along the coast of the central region and also claim territory all the way up to the bridge leading into Prima Jama. Here I have a couple of pictures of different games and some like fun little like overlaid images of different stuff that we had done during the summer offensive. So this is the Battle of St. Yeltsville down here. There's like orcs moving in toward Fort Barras. These are photos from the orc exclusion zone. These two on the right are both from orc attacks into Fort Barras. So around about this time, we're maybe, I want to say probably 3 or 4 years into Jornath as a narrative setting at this point. The Imperial Guard Army group arrives. In terms of how long it's been for the actual timeline, it's been maybe 6 months of fighting so far on Jornath. If the orcs land in the spring, it's now early autumn. The 537th Army Group arrives in orbit around Jornath and attempts to rally the Planetary Defense Forces and break the orcs. They launch Operation Greyjewel, and this culminates in the Battle of Mendora's Grove, which would be one of the largest games we'd played up until this point. So the idea here is that Fort Barras, which had been under siege for months in game and like a year and a half in real time, needed to be secured. So the Imperial forces are going to sweep in. We're going to kind of break open the squishy underbelly of the orc siege camp by killing a lot of their war bosses and disrupting the orc logistics and supply lines going into the fight at Barras. So it's the largest set piece battle of the early war. It is a combined arms Imperial attack into the freight yard. So it sees knights and space marines, PDF formations, which had not yet been deployed to major fighting. So here you have a picture of the first Usamaj and Fusiliers cohort. And later we'll see pictures of the Prespian Airborne, which is another kind of very capable, well-equipped PDF formation. So the outcome of this was a pretty significant Imperial victory. Multiple orc war bosses were killed. The northern cohorts and the Prespians play a really significant role in the victory, and it's the first really major Imperial victory of the war. A lot of the other stuff that had happened up until this point through the summer invasion were basically containment actions. They had kept the orcs from gaining any ground, but the Imperials had a lot of trouble pushing back the orcs at all. So it had come into a bit of a gridlock. So the Battle of Mendora's Grove, this really major, vast set piece engagement. You can see here, I mean, I want to say we had 600 orc boys on the table for this game. It's this really large fight, and it was a big Imperial victory, which really gave them a lot of momentum, and helped out a whole bunch. Operation Vengeful Deliverance is the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Mendora's Grove. The first Usamaj and Fusiliers kind of pursue the Blood Axes and Death Skulls under Warboss Crump as they withdraw from Fort Barras. The effort here is to just capitalize on the momentum, driving the orcs back into the mountains and hopefully beginning to reclaim some of that lost territory that had been out of reach since Remit's Maul failed. The idea here was to kind of develop staging ground for a later combined Mechanicus Imperial Guard offensive into the north to kind of finally drive the orcs into the ocean and cleanse Usamelgen itself from orc infestation. All right. Number 3, the Mid-War. Okay. The Day of the Emerald Scream is complicated. But essentially, it was a way to deviate the setting. It was a way to up the stakes, right? Jornath was never supposed to take. It was never supposed to get to this point, right? It was supposed to just sort of be like a mild, local, conventional conflict. But by this time in the real life, we had sort of gotten so many players and so many people who were interested in playing, and like the games had started to get really big and like crazy, and there was a lot of energy behind it. So narratively, we needed a way to basically be like, okay, well, right now it doesn't make sense for the level of orc forces that are on Jornath to really be able to maintain that fight for a long period of time without the Imperials just being like grounding them into the dirt. Plus, it's fun to add kind of a little bit of the sci-fi mysticism that 40k is known for into this sort of local regional conflict. So I had this idea that was basically like, well, we know that there are alpha level psychers or incredibly powerful magic users for the Imperium and for Chaos. What if there was an orc one? Which is essentially what happens. So there are story hints of this all through the early war writings, but primarily the ones dedicated to the Sons of Medusa. But it eventually culminates into the Day of the Emerald Scream, which is a massive psychic backlash confluence of orc wog energy that comes out of the orc exclusion zone. Essentially, there is a group of weird boys led by an orc weird boy who's called Bonebeard Blackstaff. He becomes known as a weird boss and creates the cult of the Black Wog. Most of the orc war bosses in the orc exclusion zone have been killed at this point, sort of throwing themselves against space marines and guardsmen and stuff like that to try and get into Kula Hive, without much success, really. So he figures that he could be the boss, and so gathers all the other weird boys together and essentially sends an astropathic signal back to the Skinner worlds to call for aid. He has also been moving through the orc exclusion zone using magic to reanimate fallen orcs. So it's essentially this idea of like he's an orc necromancer with an orc zombie army, and he ends up hiding and has a whole campaign dedicated to him. We'll get that in just a minute. But the Emerald Scream fundamentally changes the war from a local conflict. So a few 100,000 orcs or maybe 1 million to like, okay, well, now we know there's a really significant fleet of orcs coming. And the Imperium has already committed to holding the planet, and it really cannot afford to have a major trade lane overrun by orcs. So it increases the scale of why Jornath is important and the amount of resources that need to be committed to Jornath to hold the orcs at bay. From an immediate effect, it has the impact of severely compromising in-system Vox. So Imperial coordination and communication goes down for days at a time. And this is demonstrated in all kinds of different books and writings and stuff from the campaign books and stuff from this period of time. It expands the fighting on Jornath to the eastern continents, namely Altheri Hive, which is the first time that happens in the conflict. So during this period, Usamelplatz and Salzkost, which are both really major urban centers in the north, collapse due to the complete destruction of Imperial coordination and communications for several days. These are pretty significant fights, and are still actively fought over in the current timeline of Jornath. So the liberation of the Semmelplatz is something that is still very much underway by Mechanicus forces, but we'll get to that in a little while. So you can see here different games from the fall of the Semmelplatz and Salzgast. This is the fall of Wilset 542. These are villages from the previous maps that I had shown off. So there were a lot of games that took place here, and it was a wild time, and it continues to be, because that region in particular has gone sort of back and forth in terms of control. The hunt for Blackstaff. So as I mentioned, the Black Wog was led by a weird boss known as Bonebeard Blackstaff. This was the sort of the first time I started to really experiment with like co-op gaming and really small points scale type stuff that was a little bit more designed to just like kind of have these fun, like very specific narrative experiences. So I made this map that you see down here in the bottom left. This is the Stab Heels, which is a sort of an orc scrap city that's built in the orc exclusion zone. It becomes a psyker fortress city, quote unquote. Because I thought that was a very interesting idea. So the Imperial Guard, Special Forces, so Stormtroopers, that kind of stuff, Kazrakin, that sort of thing, as well as Space Marines, under the auspices of a special task force called Crimson Pendant, go into the Stab Heels to find Bonebeard Blackstaff, eliminate him, and silence the ongoing psychic echo that's being sent out into space and bouncing off Jornath's moon of Anku to amplify it into a full psychic signal that is calling the rest of the orcs into the Jornath system. So the hunt for Blackstaff was ultimately successful at halting the psychic signal and killing a lot of the Orc Witch Conclave. However, key leadership members of the Black Wog were able to escape, namely Bonebeard Blackstaff himself and Oily Maul de Black, which is sort of a mech boss turned prophet of this sort of pseudo-religious psyker wog that's been growing in the orc groups. A lot of really big characters have come out of the Hunt for Blackstaff campaign. Captain Corporus, Sergeant Rubrio from the Sons of Medusa are to name a couple. But a lot of really sort of big actions in people's memories happened during this as we kind of moved through the different areas of the Stab Heels and located and destroyed these like psychers and orc witches and disrupted their ability to call more orcs into the fight, basically. As I said, the liberation of the Semmelplatz is a complex and continuing campaign that's actually still in the midst of fighting. It takes place and kind of stretches even into the late war period, which we'll get to. Additional Imperial Guard army groups begin to arrive in the system. At this point, we're many years into Jornath, maybe like 6. So when the liberation starts, it is the first offensive operation by the Mechanicus on Jornath. The Primajama, Skitarii, and the Mechanicus aligned cohorts, which are referred to as the Crater cohorts, are working in conjunction with the Northern cohorts and forces that were participants in the Battle of Mendora's Grove. And they're all trying to basically push from 2 different directions to link up at Semmelplatz, putting a bunch of pressure on the orcs and hopefully kind of carving a big section of the Usamelgen Mountains back under Imperial control. To do that, they're seizing these different mountain towns and valleys that help to move troops and supplies through these little alpine passes and that kind of thing. The fighting's very difficult, and the Blood Axe commanders, such as Colonel Grimskull, Crump, and there's several others, but those are two that I've mentioned so far, are very adept at maneuver warfare and are really punishing any maneuvers in the region of Usamalplatz and Saltzkost. Eventually, the first Usamaj and Fusiliers are able to seize Saltzkost, but are basically pinned in place. And that's where that campaign still is to this day, right? These first assemblage and Fusiliers, other Imperial Guard assets, have basically been able to maintain a ragged line and are maybe like 50 or 60 kilometers away from the nearest Crater Cohort and Skitarii assets to the south of, to the south of Usalenplatz. So the liberation effort, the offensive to retake Usalenplatz itself and to kind of sweep in and cause a lot of damage to the orcs in the north, has remained indecisive, essentially ground to a halt under very competent orc generalship. Here you can see things are starting to get a little nicer, right? Some of the sort of first hallmarks of the modern game group stuff is starting to filter in at this point. I mean, some of these games too are very recent, but I think it shows like the continued professionalization of the game group and the folks who are involved in Jornath, like over time, and I think it's cool. Okay, so chapter 4 is Anku. Anku's a big one. So Anku, I mentioned very briefly, but essentially Anku is an exoplanet. It's referred to variably in some writings as a moon, but it's essentially an exoplanet that is in distant orbit of Jornath. Anku is, from a strategic level right now, amplifying the orc psychic signal from the Emerald Scream into deep space. It's essentially acting as an astropathic relay that's drawing orcs from the Skinner worlds toward Jornath, working as a beacon, so to speak. Before we get into what Anku is, the fighting on Anku, all that kind of stuff, we can talk a little bit about what Anku is. So Anku, like I said, is an exoplanet in the Jornath system. It stayed loyal during the Horus Heresy. Jornath did not. Jornath was aligned with the traitors for the most part. When the Horus Heresy ended, the families on Jornath, which were treasonous, were sent to Anku for essentially re-education, in the most polite possible way. It created essentially a underclass of former nobles on Anku called the Redempto Fraterni. So Anku itself is very culturally similar to Jornath. It has a lot of early homogenization between the proto versions of the Ecclesiarchy, which is the cult Imperialis, and Mechanicus aligned subcults. So it has a very unique merging between both the Mechanicus and Imperial state religions. And this has led to a lot of the people on Anku having some kind of cybernetic augmentation. The Emerald Scream, the psychic impact, hits Anku. Now, whether or not the orcs intended to do that or not is not clear. It's very unlikely. But the orc psychic impact, when it hits Anku, disrupts the Ankuvian noosphere, or the interconnected sort of information exchange and data network of Anku. And it morphs into essentially Xenos scrap code that drives majority of the population utterly insane. These guys are called the Ankuvian Renegades, or occasionally the Ankuvian Berserkers in some of the writings. These renegades rampage across the surface, and they attack those that are unaffected by the scrap code and each other. The Ankuvian loyalists are led by Sabrina Tercer. They withdraw to the High Civitan's palace in Lince's hive, where they call for aid. At this point, right, following the Emerald Scream, right, it's pretty clear that Jornath's going to need additional assistance. So the 537th Army Group of the Imperial Guard is already present, as well as the several Space Marine chapters. At this point, other army groups start to arrive, as well as really significant heavier forces like night houses and that kind of stuff. The Ankuvian Civil War is a pretty short-lived affair, and it's not one that was played in tabletop in any significant capacity. It was done in Inquisitor a little bit. There was a few kill team games for the Ankuvian Civil War. It had a lot of really interesting miniatures work and stuff that was done. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting little time capsule of this period of the conflict, but because it is a derivation from humans versus orcs. But I digress. Battlegroup Anku. So this is formed from freshly arrived Imperial forces. A lot of the 537th Army Group and Space Marines are already present in the battle space, are pretty thoroughly engaged on Jornath itself. These new reinforcements are led by Lieutenant Thade of the Imperial Dragoons. The Dragoons are very important in Volland because they are a part of the original Praecies Valandia, which is like a alliance of Space Marine chapters that has suffered a lot during the Noctis Aeterna, but have been reformed now that the Indomitus Crusade has come through and sort of liberated Volland from some of its troubles. So the formation of Battlegroup Anku and their efforts to go to Anku to stop the Emerald Scream and to essentially like provide a bulwark for Jornath to prepare for the incoming Orc fleet is the first major action of the reformed Praecies Valandia. Importantly, Anku also becomes the first major action of elements of the Legia Custodes in Volland sector. The Custodes are the Imperial bodyguard, so there are 10,000 of them. They're super transhumans. Specifically, the Legio Custodes assets that were present at Jornath were a part of the Achillean Shield, which has a little bit of an interesting background, but essentially they are custodes who use divination to find individuals throughout the Imperium who will be of importance. And then they go protect them to make sure that they can fulfill their role in fate to accomplish specific end results for the Imperium. So they show up to protect Lieutenant Thade because he is preordained to do great works in the Emperor's name in the future. Yeah, so Battlegroup Anku has a couple of different goals. The first, like I said, is to destroy the Xenos psychic signal echo that's emanating from Anku's hive city and prevent it from pulling more orcs or acting as a beacon to pull more orcs into the system. It is also tasked with delaying the Orc Skinner world fleet for as long as possible to provide Jornath as much time as it can to prepare a suitable defense to counter the incoming now primary fleet of orcs, right? So when the Frontier War happened and the orcs kind of pursued the Obergov cartel members to Jornath, that was just a subdivision of some of the orcs that were there. They sort of followed them. Those pulled more orcs, but it wasn't by any means the full amount of the Skinner Worlds, right? The Skinner Worlds itself is about a dozen systems. There are tens of millions, billions of orcs potentially that live in the Skinner Worlds, and they've been pretty content to fight amongst themselves or harass other local alien cultures for the time being. But the psychic echo from the Emerald Scream begins to pull the primary fleet of the Skinner Worlds under its leader, known as the Starflayer, which is a super powerful Ork War boss. And he basically leads his fleet into orcs or into Imperial space for the first time in many generations to see what this signal is and to gain territory. So the initial landings at Lince's Hive by Battle Group Anku go pretty well. They engage both orcs and renegade Ankuvians. They're able to connect with loyalist Ankuvians in Lince's Hive's palace and extract them. Parts of that were done in Kilheim. Parts of that were also done in Dark Heresy. The Orc Vanguard elements from their newly arriving fleet begin landing in the areas outside of Lince's Hive on Anku. And they're quickly confronted by the Imperial Dragoons and the specialist guard forces that come with Battle Group Anku to the planet. So you can see here a little bit of the difference in fighting, right? You have these really big kind of set pieces of armor engagements and knights are present and all this stuff. It kind of is a different tenor, right? The idea here was I wanted to change up the way in which we were thinking about the war for Jornath, right? Anku was supposed to be like a Space Marine war, right? Like it reads like a classic 40K novel, like huge Space Marine warriors fighting hordes of orcs in crazy situations, right? Whereas Jornath is supposed to read more like a World War II documentary. So it's a little bit different, right? So the idea here is that the Space Marines are trying to lure the orcs into kill zones and continue to do really significant damage to them. In the previous photo, you saw the House Raven Knights fighting orcs. So the idea here was that the Imperial Guard and House Raven would lead the orcs into specific preordained kill zones. They succeeded in doing that and led the Vanguard Orc landings into Sluice Processional 74 East, which is on the eastern side of Lince's Hive, and was a prepared defensive fortification built by the Imperial Dragoons and their allies, dedicated specifically to killing as many orcs as possible. So the battle for Sluice Processional 74 East was a huge wave of orcs kind of pushing in to see how far they could get through this Imperial trap, basically. It ended up pretty significantly butchering the orcs and really bought the Imperium a lot of time on Anku. Anku in general would kind of be the steady drumbeat of Imperial victories. And where Jornath itself, the actual war there is kind of, sometimes the orcs get really good streaks of victory. Sometimes the Imperium gets this like big, really significant victory. Like it kind of goes back and forth. Anku was just Imperial victories. Like it was, the orcs could not catch a break through the entirety of Anku. And so it's a little bit interesting in that like it sort of works out, right? Because the Custodes and all these like really heavy elite forces of Imperial troops are on Anku resisting, and so it's just really interesting how that ended up working out. But it did make the the battle for Anku a little one sided. In the battle for Lincez Hive, um, has a whole bunch of different fighting in it. It combines street to street fighting, strikes at the ever increasing number of orc landing zones, actions by Inquisition kill teams and Astartes kill teams searching for locations and focal points of the scrap code that the Emerald Scream caused. So this whole um, the whole fight for Lincez Hive was done in 40k and Kill Team, Dark Heresy, Inquisitors, and done in a number of different ways. And so, in that way, it was very rewarding just to kind of get a feel for how we could experiment with different types of games and different types of interactions. You can see here the Custodes, and there's Guard and Space Marines, and boarding action type situations and that kind of stuff. This is a co-op game that we played. Some interior actions to try and disrupt orc battle fortresses that were being built. So, Lincez Hive is a very long period of time. It eventually culminates in the Starflayer himself, Ortoxus Hide Stompa, which is the big bad, right? The Starflayer, master of a dozen settled orc systems and thousands of warbands. He lands at Anku at the head of his grand fleet. So the grand fleet of the Starflayer shows up. They at last arrive in the Jornath system, and so this is it, right? Battle Group Anku has been holding flawlessly for several years of real game time, and several months in universe time. So they arrive. We played a battle here, which is the Starflayer's Court of War bosses battling for the honor of being the one to lead his forces into battle to claim the world for the Starflayer. This would result in the Battle of the High Civitan's Palace in Lincez Hive. And this is the biggest battle so far in Jornath's history. It's multi-part, but it's pretty significant and has a lot of ramifications. So Orc Weight of Numbers pushes back Battle Group Anku from the places they're holding throughout Lincez Hive. It's no longer tenable for them to hold back the sheer weight of numbers of the orcs that have been landing now that the Grand Fleet is in the system. The withdrawal process begins for Imperial Guard assets that have accompanied Battle Group Anku. They start to pull back. Transhuman forces and the Guard Special Forces units, like Stormtroopers, begin to prepare the capital for the last stand on Anku. As I mentioned, this is the largest battle of the Mid-War period. Imperial operations have successfully delayed the Orc fleet for many months, much longer than it was originally anticipated to have done so. This allowed for Jornath to carry out a whole number of important tactical reforms to the planetary defense forces. But it also allowed for the newly arrived Imperial Guard army groups to get into position and to prepare for the grand fleet of the Starflayer to arrive in the system. They also managed to locate every portion of the psychic echo coming from Anku that was caused by the Emerald Scream. Many of these were contained by the Ordos Valandia, which was the Inquisition house that is present in Valand. So that also sort of blacked out Anku as a psychic beacon that orcs could use to reach Jornath. So here you can see, I'll just kind of briefly touch on this, but this is the battle for the southern gate of the High Sifton's Palace. You can see really significantly large game, huge numbers of orcs and incredibly large vehicles coming in and doing a lot of damage. The inner warrens come after this, and these are sort of orcs trickling through the last vestiges of the gardens and the administrative clusters of the inner palace. And that finally ends in the battle at the just past the docking areas in the High Sifton's Palace. And this battle becomes known as the Martyrdom of Cadmus. You can see here, I love this picture on the right, so I made it really large. The like custodians of the Achillean shield sort of standing off against Squiggoths and tidal waves of orc boys. The Imperial last stand here on the sort of sanctuary mount type thing. The withdrawal from Anku happens as the martyrdom of Cadmus is occurring. Shield Captain Cadmus is slain at the last stand of the Custodian Guard. Later, Anku would be remade into a shrine world in his honor because he is a Custodes. And the world would be renamed from Anku to Cadmus's Rest. So, writings in Valand that take place after the War for Jornath refer to Anku as Cadmus's Rest. Trying to team the survivors from the last stand fight to docking areas to rejoin the departing battle group Anku flotilla, having successfully delayed the orcs as long as they could. Orc fleet assets begin to harass battle group Anku's departure all the way into Jornath, and this leads into a major fleet action which occurs in Jornath's high orbit above the Rit Expanse, which is the major desert area in the southwestern part of Jornath. You see here some pictures of different co-op games. I've tried in these to try and take pictures from different participants. So the bottom left you have Evan Zinda, and we have games where Owen has participated in the past and all that kind of stuff. So I wanted to try and get everybody who's ever participated in Jornath at least into the slideshow somewhere. Here you can see a co-op game and boarding action games and all this kind of stuff that kind of illustrates the Space Marines trying to get onto ships to get out of Anku as the orcs kind of fully hit home, or defend their ships as they're being boarded by orc Marines on their way back to Jornath. Okay, 5, late war. So the landings in the Rit Expanse. The orc forces overwhelm the Jornathi system defense fleet and battle fleet Valand. Both of those fall back to the Breach of Themistocles, which is in the Jornath system, and kind of regain their strength. The sheer mass of the Grand Fleet of the Starflayer pushes back Imperial Fleet assets, and these orcs start to begin landing en masse in the Rit Expanse, west of Oakensid Hive. PDF formations sally out of Oakensid to meet the orcs, and the largest armored engagement of the war begins in the desert. There are a variety of games that happen during this period. Here you can see the wreck of the Lacrimae, which is a downed Imperial cruiser that crashed into the Rit. It was an outcome from one of our games. The fire decks on this cruiser can be used to fire on Oakensid or to fire into the desert. So it became a strategic asset for Imperial forces to control. Once we get here, we've kind of entered into the modern system of writing for Jornath and for Valand in general. We're writing modules, hosting formal events through Discord. People are coming. There's a general quality that's been provided with a section of lore followed by concise rules, followed by specific event dates and briefings. And so we've kind of gotten into a rhythm of of how this works, which has been very, very beneficial. The landings are in the Rid Expanse are disrupted by PDF units, right? As I said, the battle group Anku was able to really successfully delay the orcs from getting there, from getting to Jornath. So the PDF has been restructured under the new model cohort system, which is a way that Imperial Tactica Command can get their arms around the way in which Imperial strategic forces need to be able to operate a little more concisely, right? So they kind of force different disparate forces together. This is not a perfect solution, but it is better than nothing. It's better than what they had before. It doesn't really work. It causes a lot of issues, but it does mean that they have larger formations of men with slightly homogeneous equipment that can be moved to locations of need. Operation Kingmaker is launched by one of these units. It's led by Colonel Bauer, who is a cohort commander of the newly constructed new model cohorts from Oakenzid. He goes out into the desert to try and use his armor of the 4th Uval Agri Cavalry to link with the 119th Division of the 537th Army Group. And they're attempting to get to a town called Larkbost, which is in the center of the Rid Expanse. It's basically an oil refinery and agricultural center. They're hoping to kill War Boss Dome Choppa, who is a Death Skulls War Boss who is leading the landings in the Rit and has caused a lot of problems for the southern defenses of Jornath in the past. Sandstorms and continued orc landings make Operation Kingmaker dubiously successful at best. A lot of Imperial assets get pretty trashed during this period, but there are some bright moments. So it's kind of on the edge, right? The orcs are threatening to quickly overrun southern Jornath through sheer weight of numbers, but the Imperium has had a long time to prepare, and the orcs haven't yet hit the prepared defenses that the Imperium has been creating. So that brings us to the last chapter, the conclusion. So Jornath's conclusion and the late war. So for a long time, we've kind of known where Jornath's end state was going to be, and that, especially with the way that Anku went, we knew that basically the orcs were going to inevitably be pushed out of Jornath. The Imperium had a lot of time to prepare the ground, that it was very unlikely that the orcs would be able to like fully take Jornath at any point. They have a couple of different storylines that we need to wrap up, or it would be the finishing of the Rid Expanse Armored War, the Siege of Oakenzid, how the Starflare and his war bosses are routed from Jornath. We need to finish the liberation of Usamaplatz in the north, right? See the Mechanicus and the Guard finally retake the northern mountains. Something that I didn't really talk about here in this video, because it is already rather long, is the cleansing of the coastline of the central continent, Manfredi et Prima, which is the area around the Orc exclusion zone. So that area has seen a lot of campaigns back and forth, but has never truly been resolved. So the orcs are kind of in all these little pockets all over Jornath and need to be pushed out still. The photos that are on this slide here are pretty interesting. They're from Stuart Baltflower of Devos 4 blog fame. And this is his group in England. They play in Reconstruction era Jornath, which is the post-war model. So this is after the Starflare has been routed from the planet and the majority of the fighting has been resolved, but there's still pockets of orcs that are causing problems and raiding and doing things. And so there's still a lot to tell for Jornath, right? There's still a lot to explore and talk about and see what we can find out. Yeah. So a lot of talking. I sure do hope that it made some degree of sense. I hope that you feel like you have a better understanding now about Jornath and about like what everything has been leading towards and what the narrative is. For me, Jornath is really special because it just represents like a really unique decade-long collaborative hobby project that has had dozens of players from all across the U.S. and from England. It was really foundational to Grey Mountain Gaming and to other hobby projects that I've been able to work on. I think it's really unique in that there's a lot of like it's a game, but it's also writing and it's also art, and it's just a really interesting like world building project that's been going on for a really long time. And I don't know that stuff like Jornath or like Volland really exists in the wargaming space in the same way that it does in like tabletop roleplay, right? I'm hopeful that someday we can fully finish Jornath, right, and kind of tie it in a bow. I think we're getting there. I think that the setting has been going on for a really long time, and interest has ebbed and flowed. Obviously, it's a decade long project, but I feel like every time I revisit Jornath and kind of get into the lore and like start checking my information against previous writings and making sure that if I say the 119th Division is here, that they were there in every other piece of information that I've ever written about it. And, I just get really engaged working on Jornath as a setting. And I hope everyone else feels the same way. It's been a really cool way to explore Warhammer. And for me, too, like, there are people who have played Jornath who are not with us anymore or who have kind of moved out of my life. So it's been really rewarding to like look back on like Remitz Mall or you know these big campaigns that we've played and be like, oh hey, like I remember when this happened and so on and so forth. But yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for listening to me rant for I'm sure this is like an hour long or more, but I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it made some degree of sense. And talk to you all next time.